Karen had always considered herself a person who deserved special treatment. She was the type to walk into a room and expect people to move out of her way, not because she was important, but because she believed she should be. On a bright, sunny afternoon, she found herself walking through the royal palace grounds, a place filled with history, prestige, and quiet elegance. Tourists were busy snapping photos, and the atmosphere was a blend of awe and excitement. The palace guards, dressed in their immaculate uniforms, stood still and statuesque, guarding the royal entrance as they always did. Karen, with her usual sense of entitlement, was strolling through the area, her eyes scanning everything with a kind of superiority. She didn't understand the significance of the royal guards standing at attention, or the fact that they had been trained to remain unmoving in their duty. She saw them as just another obstacle standing in her way. As she approached one of the guards, she was surprised to see that he didn't acknowledge her. He didn't give her any eye contact or show any sign of movement, something that made her feel almost invisible. To her, it felt like a challenge. "Why isn't he paying attention to me?" she muttered to herself. Without even thinking, she stopped right in front of him and waved her hand in front of his face. He didn't flinch, not even for a second. The guard remained perfectly still, a reflection of his strict training. Karen, growing impatient, began to raise her voice. "Excuse me. Do you know who I am?" she demanded, thinking the guard should instantly react to her presence. The guard, with his helmet firmly in place, did not respond. He had been trained to remain silent and composed, no matter the situation. But Karen's patience was running out, and she wasn't used to being ignored. She grew louder, and her words turned harsher. She continued to make demands, expecting the guard to break his composure and acknowledge her. Seeing that the guard wouldn't respond in any way, Karen felt a spark of irritation. Her frustration quickly transformed into anger. "This is ridiculous," she said under her breath, her voice growing louder. Without giving it a second thought, she raised her hand and slapped the guard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed in the still air. It was a shocking moment for anyone nearby, as it wasn't just a disrespectful gesture, it was a direct challenge to the guard's dignity. The guard didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. He remained perfectly still, maintaining his discipline and composure as if nothing had happened. His silence only seemed to fuel Karen's anger. She stood there, expecting him to react, but instead, he didn't give her the satisfaction of a response. A small crowd had gathered by now, murmuring among themselves, their eyes wide with disbelief. They could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. Karen, however, was too caught up in her own anger to notice the onlookers. She expected an apology, some sort of explanation, but none came. The guard stood his ground, and the more he remained silent, the more Karen felt her power slipping away. This was a moment where Karen's world, as she knew it, began to crumble. What she didn't realize was that her actions, so bold and unprovoked, had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything for her. The slap had been a bold and impulsive move, one that Karen immediately regretted, though she would never admit it. She stood there, hands on her hips, waiting for the royal guard to react in some way, perhaps to apologize, or at least show some sign of embarrassment. But there was nothing. The guard's face remained expressionless behind his helmet, and he didn't move a muscle. It felt as though she was invisible, her action nothing more than a small ripple in the vast sea of palace protocol. The bystanders around her began whispering among themselves, their voices a low hum that carried through the air. Some people had their phones out, recording the moment, likely shocked by what had just unfolded. Karen could sense the eyes on her now. She looked around, expecting at least a few sympathetic glances, but instead, all she could see were wide eyes and stares of disbelief. It was a public spectacle, and she was the center of it. Feeling the weight of the moment, Karen's frustration only deepened. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially after making such an effort to command attention. As her gaze shifted from the silent guard to the murmuring crowd, she began to raise her voice again. This time, she was loud, determined to make sure everyone around knew that she wasn't in the wrong. "Are you all just going to stand there and let this happen?" she demanded, her voice tinged with disbelief. "This is outrageous. Someone should do something." But the more she spoke, the more the crowd seemed to grow uncomfortable. It was clear that people weren't on her side. They were either stunned by the guard's stoic reaction, or perhaps even felt a sense of respect for his composure. No one stepped forward to support Karen's cause, and in fact, more people seemed to be taking a step back, their phones still recording the strange encounter. At that moment, a few Royal Security officers appeared on the scene. Their uniforms were neat, their expressions serious. They didn't rush, but their presence alone was enough to shift the energy. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, approached Karen calmly and without haste. He looked from the guard to Karen, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the situation. "You need to step aside, ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This behavior is unacceptable." Karen, however, wasn't ready to back down. She was in full fight mode now, and no one was going to tell her that she was wrong. "Unacceptable," she repeated, her voice growing louder. "He didn't even acknowledge me. I have every right to be here, and he's treating me like I'm invisible. You don't just stand there like a statue and expect people to respect you." The officer did not react to her outburst. He simply nodded and called over another member of the security team, who moved to the side and began talking to a few of the nearby witnesses. It was clear that Karen's outburst had already made the situation worse, and the security personnel knew they had to handle things quickly before it escalated further. Karen, now feeling a bit cornered, turned her focus back to the officer. "You can't just let him get away with this. I deserve an apology," she demanded, almost pleading for some kind of validation. The officer remained composed, his tone unwavering. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us. There will be no apology from the guard. His job is to maintain discipline and security, and that's what he's done. Your actions have been noted, and we'll be escorting you from the premises." It was at that moment that Karen realized the gravity of her situation. The shock of her slap, the way she had treated the guard, and now the officer's calm but firm words, all seemed to come crashing down on her. She had assumed that her behavior would be excused, that people would fall in line and recognize her importance. But instead, her actions were leading her into deeper trouble. And what's worse, there was no turning back now. The security officers were already signaling for backup, and it seemed like her time in the palace was quickly running out. As the officer calmly signaled for more security personnel, Karen's frustration began to grow. She hadn't expected things to spiral this quickly. The idea that her outburst could lead to such serious consequences hadn't crossed her mind when she slapped the royal guard. Now, surrounded by more officers, her defiant attitude began to crack. She was no longer the confident woman who felt entitled to special treatment. Instead, she was now faced with the realization that her actions had pushed her into a corner, and there was no easy way out. The crowd around them had only grown larger, people watching the unfolding drama with interest. The air felt heavy with tension as Karen stood, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She refused to let her emotions show, but it was clear from her clenched jaw and rapid breathing that she was trying to regain control of the situation. She wanted to shout at the officers, argue, and make them see how she had been wronged. But something told her that it wouldn't make a difference now. The officers remained calm and professional, their expressions serious but not unkind. They weren't there to escalate the situation, but to ensure that order was maintained. One of them moved toward Karen, gently but firmly guiding her away from the scene. "Ma'am, please come with us," he said quietly, trying to keep the situation from becoming any more dramatic. Karen hesitated for a moment, her pride and sense of entitlement still fighting against the reality of what was happening. She opened her mouth, ready to argue further, but the stern look in the officer's eyes made her stop. The other security personnel were standing by, waiting for her to comply. The weight of the moment settled over her, and she realized she had little choice. With a sharp exhale, Karen took a step back, her shoulders slumping as the officer gently placed a hand on her arm, guiding her towards the exit. The other bystanders continued to watch, some still recording the moment, while others whispered quietly to each other. Karen had hoped for sympathy, but now it was clear that the crowd had already made up its mind about her behavior. As she was led through the palace gates, Karen's mind raced. How had things gotten so out of hand? She had simply wanted to enjoy her day at the palace, to feel important, but now she was being escorted out like a criminal. The embarrassment she felt was almost unbearable. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she could control the situation. But the reality of the royal guard's unwavering professionalism had shattered that illusion. As they reached a quieter area away from the crowds, the officer placed a pair of handcuffs around Karen's wrists, a reminder that her actions were being taken seriously. It was a sobering moment. The tightness of the cuffs around her wrists was uncomfortable, and Karen could feel the heat of humiliation rising in her cheeks. The officers didn't say much as they continued to escort her, but she could sense that they were disappointed by her behavior. For the first time, Karen's confidence seemed to crumble. She had never experienced anything like this before. She had always been the one who called the shots, the one who demanded respect. And now here she was, being treated as if she were the one in the wrong. She had never imagined something like this could happen to her. As she was led to the back of a police vehicle, Karen couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had turned against her. Her actions had gone from an impulsive decision to something much bigger than she had anticipated. And now, she had no choice but to face the consequences of her behavior. The journey from the palace gates to the waiting vehicle felt long and uncomfortable, each step making her more aware of the gravity of what she had done. As Karen was escorted toward the waiting police vehicle, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of disbelief. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the series of events that had led her to this point. Just moments ago, she had been walking confidently through the palace grounds, thinking she could get away with anything. Now she was in handcuffs, being led away like a criminal, her pride shattered. Her heart pounded in her chest as she was pushed gently into the back of the vehicle. The door slammed shut behind her, and for the first time, Karen realized how alone she felt. The vehicle's interior was stark and cold, a far cry from the luxurious surroundings she had been walking through only minutes ago. The officers, still silent, took their places in the front of the vehicle, leaving Karen to stew in her thoughts. Her once strong sense of entitlement now felt foreign to her, replaced by the harsh reality of her actions. Karen's mind raced, replaying the moment when she had slapped the royal guard. She couldn't believe she had done it, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been wronged in some way. After all, wasn't she important? Wasn't she entitled to some level of respect, even from a silent guard? The more she thought about it, the more confused she became. She had acted out of frustration, yes, but wasn't that enough of an excuse? As the vehicle moved through the city streets, Karen glanced out the window, watching the world pass by. The streets were busy, people walking by without a care in the world, while she sat there, her hands cuffed, unable to escape the situation she had created. She thought about what her friends and family would think if they saw her now. Would they be shocked? Would they understand why she had acted the way she did? Or would they, like the crowd of the palace, see her for what she truly was in that moment, a person who had let her frustration get the best of her? The longer Karen sat in the back of the vehicle, the more she began to feel the weight of her actions. She had tried to justify them at first, but now, with the officer's silence and the cold reality of the situation, she could feel the regret creeping in. It wasn't just the slap. It was the way she had carried herself, so convinced that she deserved special treatment, that she could push boundaries without consequences. When the vehicle finally arrived at the station, the officers led her inside, still silent but firm in their professionalism. The building was stark and uninviting, a sharp contrast to the royal palace she had been so eager to experience just hours ago. Karen was led to a small room, where she was told to sit and wait. The officers didn't offer her any comfort or sympathy, and for the first time in a long while, Karen felt utterly powerless. She sat in the empty room, her hands still cuffed in front of her. The sound of her breathing filled the silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just about a slap or a misunderstanding. This was about the consequences of her behavior. She had thought she could get away with it, but now, with each passing minute, it was becoming painfully clear that her actions had led her to a much bigger problem. Karen had always been the one who made the rules, who demanded respect from others, but now, in this small, quiet room, she realized that sometimes respect wasn't something you could just expect. It had to be earned. And in that moment, Karen wasn't sure she had earned anything at all. Karen sat in the small, dimly lit room, her hands still cuffed and her mind racing. The officers had left her there to wait, and the silence that filled the space was overwhelming. She could feel the weight of the handcuffs pressing uncomfortably into her wrists, a constant reminder of what had just happened. Everything had changed in an instant, and she was struggling to process the reality of it all. The minutes ticked by slowly, and Karen's thoughts began to circle back to the events at the palace. She remembered the slap, the sharp sound of it echoing in the air, and the way the guard hadn't reacted at all. At the time, it had felt like a small act of rebellion, a way to get her point across. But now, sitting in this sterile room, she realized how wrong she had been. The guard had simply been doing his job, maintaining the dignity of his position, while she had let her frustration get the best of her. She thought about the officer who had calmly escorted her out of the palace. His professionalism had been a stark contrast to her own behavior, and the more she reflected on it, the more she felt embarrassed. How had she let things spiral so far? Why hadn't she just walked away when the guard didn't respond? Instead, she had let her ego take over, and now she was paying the price. Karen's thoughts shifted to the crowd at the palace. She had seen their shocked expressions, their phones raised to capture the moment. In that moment, she had felt like the center of attention, but now she wasn't so sure she wanted to be the star of the show. The idea that her actions had been shared on social media filled her with a deep sense of humiliation. Would people see her as the villain in the story, or would they understand her frustration? The idea of people judging her made her stomach turn, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had already made her own judgment. Her mind also drifted to her friends and family. What would they say when they heard about the incident? Would they support her, as they often had in the past? Or would they be just as shocked and disappointed as the people who had witnessed the scene at the palace? Karen had always prided herself on being the one who stood out, the one who demanded attention, but now she wasn't sure she liked what that attention had brought her. As she sat there, the door to the room opened, and one of the officers returned. Karen looked up, her heart racing again. Was it time for her to be questioned? Would she be allowed to speak, or would they simply tell her what would happen next? The officer motioned for her to stand up, and for a moment, Karen hesitated. She wasn't sure what was coming, but she knew that it would likely be serious. "Please come with me," the officer said, his tone still firm but not unkind. Karen stood up slowly, the weight of her cuffs still heavy on her wrists. The officer led her through the building, and as they walked, Karen couldn't help but notice the stark, no-nonsense atmosphere of the place. There was no warmth here, no comfort, just a place for people who had made mistakes to face the consequences of their actions. When they reached a small interrogation room, the officer gestured for her to sit down. Karen followed his instructions, her nerves tightening in her stomach. The room was bare, with only a table and a few chairs. There was no window, no hint of the outside world. She was isolated now, and the reality of what had happened to her felt even more intense in this cold, quiet room. The officer sat across from her, his eyes calm but unwavering. "Ma'am, I'm sure you realize the seriousness of the situation," he began. "What you did was unacceptable. We need to understand why you acted the way you did." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but found that the words wouldn't come. How could she explain herself? How could she justify what she had done? There was no excuse. She had acted out of anger, out of a need to control a situation that she didn't understand. She had let her own sense of entitlement take over, and now she had to face the consequences. The officer waited patiently for her to respond, giving her time to gather her thoughts. As Karen sat there, her eyes downcast, she felt a deep sense of regret wash over her. The reality of the situation had set in, and it was far worse than she had ever imagined. She had thought she could simply walk away from her actions, that the world would bend to her will. But now, sitting in this room, she understood that there were consequences to everything. And sometimes, the price was much higher than you expected. The room felt even colder as Karen sat across from the officer, the silence pressing down on her. Her palms were sweating, and her heart was racing in her chest. She hadn't expected to find herself in this situation, and now that she was here, it seemed almost unreal. Everything had happened so fast. One moment, she was strolling through the palace grounds with a sense of confidence, and now she was facing the consequences of a rash decision. The officer's steady gaze never wavered as he waited for her to speak. Karen felt the weight of his silence, as though he was expecting her to explain herself. She knew she couldn't hide from what she had done, and deep down, she realized that the only way out of this was to own up to her actions. But that wasn't easy for someone like her. She had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules, and now she was the one who had broken them. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to figure out how to begin. How could she possibly explain her behavior? How could she make sense of the irrational outburst that had led her here? The more she thought about it, the more she realized how petty and unnecessary it had all been. She had let her pride take over, and now she was paying the price. I don't really know what came over me," Karen finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "I was frustrated. I thought the guard should have paid more attention to me, and when he didn't, I didn't think." She paused, her face flushing with embarrassment as the words left her mouth. "It was stupid, I know." The officer nodded slightly but didn't respond. He seemed to be listening carefully, but he wasn't offering any immediate judgment. Karen couldn't tell whether he was waiting for more, or if he was simply processing what she had said. The silence between them grew heavy once more. "I've never been in a situation like this," Karen continued, her voice more uncertain now. "I've always been able to get what I want, and I thought that I could just demand respect. But now I see that I was wrong. I don't know what I was thinking." The officer's expression remained unreadable, but his silence was no longer as intimidating. Karen wasn't sure if he was giving her space to reflect on what she had said, or if he was waiting for more of an explanation. Either way, she felt an overwhelming sense of regret, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She glanced down at her cuffed wrists, the metal biting into her skin. The discomfort reminded her of how much her world had shifted in such a short time. Everything she had taken for granted, the respect, the attention, was now slipping away from her. She had thought that behaving like this would earn her the respect she thought she deserved, but now it had only led her to a place where she felt powerless and ashamed. "I was wrong," Karen repeated softly, more to herself than to the officer. "I shouldn't have done it. I should have just walked away, but instead I made a scene." Her words trailed off, and she felt the weight of her mistake settle over her. The officer finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "It's good that you recognize that what you did was wrong. But you also need to understand that actions have consequences. The guard you slapped was simply doing his job. His role is to protect and maintain order, and he did not deserve to be treated that way." Karen nodded slowly, her gaze still focused on her cuffed hands. She knew he was right. She had let her emotions get the better of her, and in doing so, she had disrespected someone who had done nothing wrong. Worse, she had caused a scene in front of a crowd, drawing attention to herself for all the wrong reasons. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The reality of the situation was sinking in more with every passing second. The officers had been patient with her, but she knew that there were still serious consequences ahead. She could only hope that by being honest and owning up to her actions, she might somehow begin to make amends. The officer stood up and walked toward the door, his expression still calm, but now tinged with a sense of finality. You'll be held for a short time, but once everything is processed, you'll have the opportunity to explain your actions further. For now, we'll take you through the next steps. Karen stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. She didn't know what the next steps would be, but she knew that this was a turning point. The arrogant confidence she had once carried with her was gone, replaced by a humbling realization of how easily things could unravel when you stopped thinking before you acted. She had thought she could handle the world, but now she was learning that the world had a way of handling her instead. As the officer led Karen out of the small room, she felt a strange mix of emotions. The coldness of the building had left her feeling small, as if she were just another person caught up in something much bigger than herself. She had always prided herself on standing out, on being someone who could command attention and respect. But now, it felt as though she were just another person waiting for her fate to be decided, and there was nothing she could do to change that. The officer guided her down a long hallway, and Karen could feel her nerves rising again. The building was quiet, almost eerily so, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. She could tell that the seriousness of the situation was beginning to sink in. Every corner she turned, every step she took, made it harder for her to ignore the reality of her actions. The slap, the anger, the frustration, it had all led to this moment. And now, there was no escaping it. As they reached a set of stairs, the officer motioned for Karen to follow. She had no idea where they were going, but she followed his lead, feeling a little more defeated with every step. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, they entered a larger area, one that seemed more like a waiting room than anything else. Several people were sitting there, looking just as anxious as Karen felt. She tried not to make eye contact, but her gaze inevitably shifted toward them. Everyone had their own story, their own reasons for being there. And for a moment, Karen wondered how many of them had found themselves in a situation like hers. The officer stopped in front of a counter and exchanged a few words with another officer behind the desk. Karen stood there, her hands still cuffed in front of her, feeling the weight of the situation press down on her. She had always been the one to make things happen, to get her way, but now she felt completely powerless. There was no more pretending, no more manipulating the situation. All she had left was the truth of what she had done. Finally, the officer turned to her. "You're going to be processed now," he said, his tone neutral. "This won't take long, but it's important that you cooperate fully." Karen nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to say something, to explain herself more fully, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say that hadn't already been said? She had acted on impulse, and now she had to face the consequences. She had no one to blame but herself. The officer led her to a small room where she was asked to sit down. It was another stark space, with only a few chairs and a table. The officer motioned for her to sit, and she did, trying to calm her racing heart. The minutes felt like hours as she waited. Time seemed to move differently when you were stuck in a situation you couldn't control. As she sat there, Karen couldn't help but think about the guard. She hadn't even known his name, but now she felt a pang of regret for the way she had treated him. He had been doing his job, something that Karen had failed to recognize in her frustration. She had expected respect without considering the effort that others put into their own roles. The realization was a hard one, and it made her feel even smaller than she had before. Her mind then drifted to her family. What would they think when they found out about this? Would they be angry, disappointed, or would they try to understand why she had acted the way she did? Karen had always been able to count on them for support, but now she wasn't sure how they would respond. She had never imagined that something like this would happen to her. She had always been careful, always made sure she stayed in control, but now she felt completely out of her depth. Finally, the officer returned, and Karen was led through another series of rooms. Each step felt heavier than the last, and by the time she was brought before the next person in charge, she had already lost track of how long she had been there. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: her life had changed in ways she hadn't expected. The officer explained the next steps to her calmly, outlining the process that would follow. Karen listened quietly, trying to absorb everything. It wasn't easy, but she knew that the more she cooperated, the sooner this would be over. The reality of her situation was slowly starting to settle in, and she knew she would have to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how difficult it might be. For the first time, Karen truly understood the value of taking a step back, of thinking before acting. It was a hard lesson to learn, but one that would stay with her long after the events of the day had passed. Karen sat quietly in the waiting room, her mind racing, but her body still. She had been in this situation for what felt like an eternity, but it was only a matter of hours. The waiting was the hardest part, waiting for the inevitable, for the decision that would shape the rest of her day, maybe even the rest of her life. She didn't know what would happen next, but deep down, she knew she had learned something important. The events at the palace had already started to fade in her mind, replaced by the quiet, serious atmosphere of the police station. Her thoughts weren't consumed by the slap anymore, but by the realization that her actions had consequences, something she had never truly understood before. As much as she wanted to explain herself, she knew that there was no way to take back what had already happened. She had acted on impulse, letting her frustration take over. There was no justification for it. And in that moment of reflection, she understood the importance of thinking before reacting. She thought about the guard, the person she had slapped, and the role he had played in keeping the peace. Karen had been so caught up in her own frustration that she had forgotten to see the bigger picture. The guard had been doing his job, and while she hadn't understood it at the time, Karen now saw that he deserved her respect, not her anger. She felt a twinge of guilt for her behavior and hoped that he wouldn't think of her as just another entitled person who thought they could get away with anything. The door opened, breaking her from her thoughts, and the officer from earlier stepped inside. He didn't say anything right away, but Karen could see the calm look in his eyes. He had been patient with her, understanding even when she wasn't making sense. His quiet demeanor was a stark contrast to the frustration she had felt earlier, and it reminded her that sometimes calmness and patience were the best ways to handle difficult situations. "Karen," the officer began, his voice steady, "we've processed everything, and now we need to talk about what happens next." Karen nodded, still unsure of what the next steps would be. She didn't want to hear anything that might make the situation worse, but she knew she had to face it. She had put herself in this position, and now she had to accept whatever came with it. "The good news is that after considering the situation, we've decided to give you a warning," the officer continued. "We believe that you understand the seriousness of what happened, and given your cooperation, we don't think further legal action is necessary. However, we want you to know that this incident has been documented. It's a reminder that every action has a consequence, and it's something you need to keep in mind moving forward." Karen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A warning. She had expected something worse, perhaps charges or a much longer detention. But instead, they had given her a second chance, a chance to prove that she had learned from her mistake. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it was tempered by the realization that she would never forget this lesson. It had been humbling, a wake-up call that had shaken her to her core. The officer gave her a small nod, indicating that their conversation was coming to an end. He motioned toward the door, signaling that she was free to go. Karen stood up, her legs still a little shaky from everything that had happened. She walked out of the room slowly, her hands still cuffed, but her mind already working through the next steps in her life. As she left the building, Karen stepped into the sunlight, the cool air a sharp contrast to the stuffy atmosphere inside. For the first time in hours, she felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't just the end of the situation. It was the beginning of something else. She had made a mistake, but now she had the chance to move forward and do better. Karen knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. She would have to work to rebuild her sense of respect and patience, not just for others, but for herself. But as she walked away from the station, she knew one thing for sure. She would never let her frustration or impulsiveness lead her down a path like this again. This experience had taught her to pause, to think, and to consider the consequences before making decisions. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life.